Welcome back to our final session. This afternoon, we have two papers. The first is on the Paycheck Protection Program. The second is on corporate restructuring. So we're going to start off with Glenn Hubbard.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Mike and I are certainly grateful to the organizers for the chance to participate. I spent my morning teaching the MBAs in a political economy class. This morning was Hayek, and I could hear his voice saying, "What's a nice boy like you doing working on the Paycheck Protection Program?" And I think Mike and I will hope to have an idea for that as we go through it. So let me try to share my screen with you. Okay, do you have it?
Well, we've got something that says Zoom on it.
That's not good.
Might be the wrong screen.
Let's see. Let's try that. No, it's not coming through.
That's looking good, and you could maximize it if you want.
Okay, great. All right, if you have it, I can't see it, but that's great. Okay, well, if you can see it, I'll just put it in slideshow and go from there.
Yep.
So the Paycheck Protection Program is obviously an interesting and relatively new and bold idea. And in taking a look at it, what Mike and I wanted to do was really get at the basic question of the title: did it succeed? And it turns out that is a much harder question to answer than one might think. Partly that's mechanical, the age of the program, but partly is the program's design. So the program, as everybody knows, is forgivable loans to small and mid-sized businesses. And it came in the context, obviously, of the very severe downturn accompanying COVID-19. The COVID-19 shock, of course, contained both supply side elements that shut down businesses in the lockdown and demand side because of credit constraints affecting many small and mid-sized firms and from losses in employment and business failures. So we look at heightened vulnerability of small and mid-sized firms, particularly because of worker-firm relationships that may be valuable and value of a time to restart for firms that fail. It's also a very large program for evaluation. In the 2008-9 crisis, the number 700 billion sent shockwaves through Washington. This program alone, as part of the CARES Act, will wind up costing that, and there's discussions of extension. We find, using Dun & Bradstreet data, that if you look at standard difference in difference models to estimate the effects of a small business applying for a PPP loan, we can only see them at a certain size that I'll mention, and of a small business being eligible for that loan based on size, we find higher employment, we find greater financial health, and we find survival. Nonetheless, Harry Truman's picture there, has it succeeded? On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, as we'll show you, it's a little bit harder to know. Now, the political process here moved very, very quickly. The original design work of the PPP did involve some economists. Both Mike and I had worked with some of the GOP congressional leaders. And again, the issue here is about balancing aggregate supply effects and aggregate demand effects. The general recommendation was for a revenue replacement program, which, as you know, is not precisely what happened in the PPP. The rationale, also in work by Eric Zwick and others are discussing, is that that provides small businesses the requisite flexibility. It would preserve also the value of worker firm matches and continuity for a quicker recovery. There are tensions, hence Hayek's voice in one's ear. If this is a shutdown that's very temporary, that kind of a program could make sense. For a longer term shutdown scenario, the question is whether it delays needed reallocation. And how do you compare the worker firm matches on the one hand with the lost reallocation? There were also implementation challenges. Nothing like this really existed for the United States, as you know, because the IRS wasn't able to do direct payments for businesses, this went through banks, not because of the quote loan element that's largely forgivable. Banks were a conduit. Other countries, as we talk about it linked in the paper, I'll just mention it here, have taken somewhat different approaches. Most European nations used a wage subsidy in which workers saw hours or pay reduced, with government picking up much of the employment cost, as in the German model. The original estimates Mike and I had given congressional leaders was a revenue replacement program would cost around $1 trillion. This is somewhat less, largely because it wasn't as generous and because its take-up was 70%, not 100%. So what do we do here? We're going to use data from Dun & Bradstreet, an old firm. In addition to RA, President Grant, President Lincoln have also mucked around in these data. We have evaluated in the paper the effects of the PPP on employment, what Dun & Bradstreet calls PAYDEX, which you can think of as a financial health score. Loosely, it's a time of repayment kind of score, and measures of continuity of the small business. We do have an issue in that in the D&B data, we can match with loan applications, and then we'll talk about eligibility with SBA, but only for applications of loans greater than 150,000. And that's because SBA released the names of businesses that applied for loans at that size, but not below, and SBA denied our FOIA request. So we don't have those very small loans. We'll talk about that in a moment. And so what we're going to do is estimate a difference in difference model of the effect of either the PPP application or eligibility based on size using several treatment and control groups. Now, there have been a number of studies that have tried to look at the PPP in various ways. Time limits, I won't mention them here. The one I will highlight, because it's probably closest to what we're going to try to do, is by David Otter and others that used ADP data, the payroll processor. And there they use difference in difference comparing employment at firms above or below the 500 employee threshold under the program and find substantial employment effects. And again, we're going to focus on these larger loans. We will also use a dynamic effect of PPP application and eligibility using event studies. Our basic estimating equation, we put a sandbox here. That's what D&B calls their data, which turned out to be somewhat harder to use than one might always imagine. But within the sandbox, one can estimate for a very large number of firms, and we have all establishments in the D&B database that are active as of December 19th that have between 1 and 1,000 employees. This is a very large sample. And we've been able to identify the businesses that applied for and are eligible for the PPP loans. And so what we're going to use outcome as a measure like employment or log employment in our case, like the PAYDEX score, or like whether the business closed. We're going to look over a 6-month period, that is months prior to the PPP and after, so a total of 6 months, 3 before and three after. We're going to have an indicator variable, whether you applied for a loan. I'll talk about eligibility in a moment. And then we're also going to look at state by month controls, industry by month controls, and so on to make sure we're not having state and industry clustering effects driving what we do. For dynamics, I won't put it up here, but equation 2 in the paper is our basic difference in difference event study. We also estimate an intent to treat model for separate demand in order to separate the demand for the PPP application from the PPP itself eligibility. So here we're just going to condition on the eligibility based on size as opposed to the application itself. Just what are our basic results? In table 4 of the paper, we focus on employment. And so if you use as a control group establishments between 501 and 1,000 employees, so larger than the threshold in the data that we have, and use as your treatment group establishments with less than 500 employees that applied for the PPP loan, and again, applied for means this particular size for us, there's this fairly significant PPP employment effect. It's 1.07%. That's likely downward biased, of course, because we don't observe all of the small loan applications. They are not available to us. If you look at the intent to treat estimates, that is conditioning on PPP size eligibility, the effect is about 0.51% for that same test group. In the fifth column, around the 500 employee cutoff, we look just below and just above. And there the effects are much smaller, suggesting that what's really driving the PPP employment effects is coming from smaller firms, at least through June. And we are finding larger effects over time as the program ages, as I'll come back to. These results are a little different from Autor et al. Because they find employment effects for larger firms as well as for smaller firms using the ADP data. In terms of dynamics, these figures look at employment, the PAYDEX score, and whether the firm has gone out of business in the D&B data. And so what you see is on the left-hand side, these are 1 to 500 employees is the group applying versus 501 to 1,000. The right-hand side, same cut, but now we're going to look at eligibility. You can see the pattern I mentioned before of rising over time. The numbers are also large. So to interpret the magnitude, if the average establishment employment fell by 0.6% January to June for 1 through 1,000 worker firms in the Dun & Bradstreet data. So when we talk about estimates like 1.1% or 0.51%, those are very large relative to the changes that happen. I don't have the slides on this, they're in the paper. If you were to look at financial health results, table 5 in the paper, this is the so-called PAYDEX score. It's a proprietary score from Dun & Bradstreet. Similar to the results for employment, the PPP seems to have had a larger impact on relatively smaller firms. And as with the employment effects of PPP, the financial health effects, at least as measured by PAYDEX, grows over time. If you were to look at all firms with 1 to 1,000 employees, again, to calibrate what's big and what's small, the average monthly PAYDEX fell by 0.32 percentage points in the entire sample. So when we have a positive effect of 0.13, that is a very big number. Finally, business continuity results we have in table 6, the 4th and 6th columns there are similar to the kinds of results that I spoke about for employment. And we find, as with the other two measures, the PPP did decrease the chance of closure, and that decrease grew substantially over time. Over time, meaning program is passed originally in March, we have data through June. Subsequently, we hope to go back and update that. So where does this put us? On the plus side, it does appear that applying for a PPP loan, at least at the size threshold we're able to consider, and PPP eligibility as determined by firm size, both of those measures raised employment, improved financial health, and improved business continuity. And those findings are robust across a lot of treatment and control groups. The PPP either took time to work its way in, that's the pattern that we observed, or was simply more effective in a partially reopened economy, the June economy. We can't really distinguish between those. There are question marks, though. This program's young, and we're only looking at the first 3 months of experience. The goals in the program included both short-term employment maintenance and medium-term business continuity. And so as the effects of the PPP unfold, it'll be important to see what happens. I would caution you, it's very hard in a project like this to look at what's marginal and what's inframarginal. It's not so easy as estimating things like a cost per job. The program had multiple goals. It was business continuity and employment. And even if one were to estimate a quote cost per job, one would have to back out avoided unemployment insurance calculations. So those are difficult in this case, and we don't have a silver bullet answer. In terms of lessons, the alternatives, at least for the US, of quickly expanding unemployment insurance were not likely to be successful, largely because of administrative issues that we're seeing in the States. Standard loans wouldn't work. What these firms needed was really equity type financing or grants, not loans. Some things to consider maybe going forward. Hopefully there's not a next time, but if there were, maybe more reliance on things like short-time compensation programs, which operate in a bare majority of US states and could be effective. Also, perhaps modifications of business interruption insurance, a la the terrorism risk insurance model, conditioned on some policy determination, like a governor closing businesses in your state. And then finally, we would urge a rethink of the design to focus again more on revenue replacement, as well as a better designed Main Street lending facility, which in the interest of time I won't talk about, but we can come back to if anybody would like. Quick lessons for practice. This program would have gotten off to a much better footing had there been more coordination in the government. Computer systems, as the picture there indicates, were significantly outdated. That sounds like an administrative detail. It really held this program back. And of course, as one would expect any economist to say, more research is needed. So what's the answer to the question? Has the Paycheck Protection Program succeeded? We would say yes, with a question mark, but I think others might have the more Zhou and Lai too early to say.
Thanks, Glenn. The comments will be given by Eric Swick.
Okay, can you hear me and see my slides?
We can.
Great. So thanks so much for inviting me to discuss this paper. I have been a longtime reader of influential Glenn Hubbard Brookings Papers, and so it's a pleasure to actually participate in the production process, even a very small contribution. So I really like this paper, not just because of the empirical analysis that Glenn summarized, but actually because it tries to take a step back and introduce kind of a verbal framework for thinking about why we should have such a program, and also does a very detailed sort of legislative almost history of the passage and implementation challenges through the first few months, which I think will be useful going forward. But I thought I actually would continue that by asking, what kind of public policy is PPP? I think as Hubbard and Strain rightly point out and argue, this is not a fiscal stimulus policy. The goal is not to increase economic activity immediately. Perhaps even the goal is the opposite, to allow people to stay home and promote a different goal socially. But this implies that the cost per job metric is either wrong or at best incomplete. Same with something like a fiscal impact multiplier. Is this a capital market support? Largely no, and I think I'll just refer to the paper that Adi presented this morning. This is not a lender of last resort style program. Output has evaporated. Loans are unattractive because they're not viable for many firms, and banks are more unwilling for private profitability of those loans to lend than they are because they're unable because of capital restrictions or something like that. I think the closest public policy analog is something like disaster relief or disaster insurance. Something like after a hurricane or tornado or something like that. The reason I put here is because there's a severe non-economic shock. There's a relatively low correlation between the short-run performance of firms and the long-run performance, which I think we use to motivate our VC interpretation of credit programs. There's a risk of losing firm worker matches and also fixed startup costs. And there are potential aggregate demand or congestion externalities that, give another justification for supporting firms through this temporary period. Unlike hurricane, the disaster has uncertain duration, so there's maybe more need for kind of a continuing program. And also there's lost revenues instead of lost capital. I think the key takeaway is that, the framework does affect how we think about the design and evaluation of this program, and also the design principles. So given that that's sort of the rough framework, how should we design and implement such a policy? Glenn didn't talk about this part of the paper, but I think it's actually a really nice feature of the paper. So I'm going to compare the Hubbard and Strain revenue replacement idea with the ideas that Sam, Adi, Jeremy, and I circulated back in April on business continuity. I think we agree on roughly 80% of the design elements, but let me focus on 3 big differences, which I think will be useful for research and policy debate going forward. First is whether or not you should include payroll. So the argument to include it is to retain the firm worker batch and to avoid further overwhelming UI systems. The argument against is it makes the program much more expensive. Maybe match quality is not as important for a lot of the firms that were affected by this shock. Firms aren't used to paying workers to idle. And so actually the mechanics of the program at the firm level when the firms weren't operating is somewhat difficult for some sort of small business owners to even wrap their minds around. UI, despite its warts, did reach 30 million workers over a pretty short period of time. And so I think we shouldn't throw the UI system under the bus, but think about ways to improve it. And this reallocation point that I think Hubbard and Strain emphasize sort of as we go into recovery mode, if you're including payroll, you're kind of deterring that relative to a more limited program. Should we use the banks as conduits? The argument for is there are pre-existing relationships, so it's easier to reach firms, and there's an underwriting infrastructure. The arguments against, well, there are misaligned incentives in the banking system relative to maybe what the social planner would want. We had to pay the banks billions of dollars to put the PPP programs out despite them being fully guaranteed. Main Street has had even more issues with getting banks to participate or help borrowers apply. There are many firms out there without banking relationships or significant banking relationships, and these are harder to reach. The banks themselves were disrupted during the initial period of the shock. And the IRS, despite its warts, has a history of implementing large-scale fiscal policy, economic impact payments, NOL carrybacks, the homebuyer credit, just to give some examples. I think we agree that the SBA was probably not the right agency for a large-scale short-term program like this. Last and maybe most controversial, on targeting. Should there be little to no targeting? The argument here is that there's unknown shock severity and timing. There's political economy considerations in choosing winners by industry. And there's potentially marginal tax rates from a forward-looking revenue target. So you might deter firms from opening if they get more forgiveness if they stay closed. The cons is that if you do little or no targeting, it might be expensive. Benefits might not be deployed to those who need it most, sort of by definition. The marginal tax rates are like the EITC. There are tax rates, but maybe they're not prohibitive. And maybe there's a perception that with little or no targeting, the program would be unfair. That's just a brief summary of differences. I would say this is an area that's inviting more formal economic study. This is an area of the pandemic where I think economists have a lot to contribute because we're good at thinking about the welfare, design, and impacts of social programs. And this is, I think, a nice, rich environment. It's a relatively new program. Okay, so moving into data. How should we grade the PPP? It's not really the cost per job, but it's something like the insurance value relative to program cost. Now, what is the consumption smoothing equivalent for firms? That's something that I'm not going to do, that we haven't done, but I think that's kind of what we need to do to really think about this program. But what I will do is ask a simpler question. If we look at who received funds, were these the, quote, high insurance value types? Do we think of that as the case? And then what did firms do with the money? So I'll come back to the empirical results at the end. First, this was a very timely program. $500 billion distributed in 6 weeks is kind of staggering. So on timeliness, A+. On targeting, so here's some results from a paper that I've worked on with some colleagues at the University of Chicago. For folks who are interested in an updated draft, please email me. We're 99% towards an updated draft with more results. I'm showing some today. Initially, the less hard-hit areas actually received more funds, partly as just sort of an artifact of idiosyncratic abilities to process loans across regions. It's hard to make the case that I think that these areas deserved more funds. Ultimately, combining both rounds 1 and 2, we see a weak correlation between the initial shock and funding, which I think is evidence of broad access to the program. It's possible that Arizona, Florida, these regions with late waves may have received funding at the wrong time. You know, what are the welfare costs of that mistiming? I think it's a question that I don't have an answer to, but it's something to raise. Here's some survey data from Facebook that folks released in an MBR working paper on Monday. So this is real-time data. What share of businesses surveyed, small businesses, experienced sales declines? This is, I think, in the month of April. So sort of post-COVID shock and shutdowns during that period of time, 30 to 40% did not experience sales declines. Within those that did, there's a lot of heterogeneity. So some weathered it relatively better, and a lot of this is sort of luck as opposed to, you know, skill or something like that. Note that a lot of firms didn't apply for PPP. A significant share of those are probably firms that weren't, you know, facing harder or revenue declines probably. So the incomplete coverage, I think, reflects a bit of this. Firms are struggling about equally to pay rent, wages, and debt. So on the left graph, it's just, what are you struggling to pay survey question. This suggests the initial payroll weight was definitely too high if we think about trying to help firms meet payments they're struggling to pay. The current payroll rate is probably also too high for the same reason. Notably, half of the firms are not struggling to make payments in April. Maybe they eventually become, you know, are struggling, but I think this also points to potential targeting issues. On the right, I think it's just interesting to note that half of the firms surveyed did not have pre-existing relationships as borrowers. They have checking accounts, but it's not clear that that's enough of a connection to a bank to make using the banks the right mechanism, because of course the IRS has the bank account information for all these firms as well, because they file taxes and put their bank account information there. And looking at the big banks, their performance in the first round was sort of underwhelming relative to what we would have expected. They improved considerably in the second round, but a lot of the second round's increase in coverage came from reallocation of borrowers to lenders that were more willing to participate or help people apply. And last, as an artifact of sort of differential bank participation or rules, larger firms receive funding first. It's not clear that this is the right targeting feature. And this is what I get at when I say maybe there's a perception there was unfair access. So the last 2 minutes, let me talk about empirics. In the Hubbard and Strain paper, what we see are modest employment effects. I think Glenn described them as large. And I think the issue there is what's the denominator you're comparing the employment effects to, and I'll mention that again in a second. But I think, you know, generally elsewhere in the literature, so in my paper, we're finding null effects in April and small effects in May and June. The Otter and 9 co-author paper also finds modest effects, and now Chetty's team has also sort of looking in May and June, and different employment indicators also suggest sort of modest employment effects, which imply a very high cost per jobs, though note that's maybe not the right metric. Modest impacts on financial vulnerability. I think we're finding more significant effects using census survey data on financial vulnerability. And my interpretation of the data so far is that this is actually an important element of the way the PPP worked, is by helping firms strengthen their balance sheets and allow them to flexibly adjust to changing circumstances, more so than sort of increasing employment. And that effects are growing over time. We are seeing that as well. So I just wanted to provide a little more confirmation. 2 concerns I have with the empirics, very briefly. Comparing loan applicants to non-applicants is going to overstate probably the effects, because there are loan demand effects. So some of the specifications have this issue, and I think we've talked a bit about that. I like the eligibility design. I think that's much better, using the 500 worker threshold. Second concern is about the Dun & Bradstreet data. So I'm a little worried that they're stale and not updated at high enough frequency. And so that's understating, or it's otherwise affecting what we're seeing in the data. So just to show that in aggregate, these are aggregate employment series for the different groups. There's actually, the y-axes make it look like there's a lot of movement, but it's actually almost no movement in the aggregates for the different groups we're studying, which is sort of unusual, because if you look on the left at ADP data, on the right at home-based data, we're seeing declines of 20 to 60% in employment payroll for these different data sets. And the Dun & Bradstreet data by comparison are showing essentially no decline in aggregates. And I think this is because Dun & Bradstreet just doesn't collect data at the high frequency you need to do this kind of month-by-month study. So I have a lot of comments to send offline. To grade the PPP, I'm going to say incomplete. And to grade the paper, I'm going to say excellent. For me, the incomplete grade has to do with if it prevented a large number of firm failures, that increases the grade a lot. If a large share of the funds were inframarginal, the incidence of that is not so great. It's mostly on the owners. And so I think distributionally and from a cost of the versus the value of the program, that raises concerns for me. The paper itself has this really thoughtful discussion of the framework and narrative of what's going on. And I think the empirics are very sensible, if still a bit of a work in progress. So thanks a lot. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks for the clear presentation and the great discussion. We have a number of questions. Caroline Hawksby.
Hi, thanks for a terrific paper, Glenn and Michael, and thanks also to Eric for his excellent discussion. It was really interesting. I want to just, before I get on to my main comment, agree with one of Eric's comments, and that's about the Dun & Bradstreet data being potentially, he called it stale. I wouldn't have used that word, but that's, I think that's an appropriate word. It's just not very sensitive relative to some of the other monthly sources of data. So I think that's a non-trivial issue. It's a pretty serious issue. Okay, going to my main comment though, in tables 4 to 6 in your paper, the specification that I always liked best was the one that was always shown in column 5. And that's the one where you are comparing the firms that have 400 to 475 employees to the firms that have 525 to 600 employees. And I think this specification is really most in the spirit of the identification strategy that you have and the sort of differences and eligibility for the PPP that you have. I think we've learned a lot over the past, I don't know, I'll just say recent years about how important it is to have a control group and a treatment group that are relatively, you could say they're balanced on the covariates, they look plausible for one another and so forth. And so the problem is that when you go to these groups, which are not small in terms of observation, so that's really not the issue, they're more comparable, but you also see really nothing in any of these column 5 specifications. So that's a big worry for me because I consider that to be by far the most plausible and well-identified specification. I also just comment that it's unfortunate that eligibility is mainly on this particular margin of the 500 employees, because that's probably not the local treatment effect that we would like to identify. I think a lot of people are really interested in smaller firms than firms that are right on that 500 person margin. I mean, there's a reason why that's the threshold. It's because above 500 employees, they aren't really small firms anymore. They're kind of large firms. And so when we identify the local treatment effect on those firms, we're leaving out the local treatment effect that we would love to see on the small firms, the restaurants, and the small businesses, the small family firms, things like that, which just don't make it into that range. I don't know that there's any sort of eligibility or identification strategy that would get at those smaller firms, but I guess I would just like to say I wish there were. Thanks.
Thanks. I'll read a question from the Q&A from Josh Gottbaum. Does the shift from a wage subsidy program to a revenue subsidy make the distributional effects of the PPP regressive, at least compared to the European programs? So we'll just put that in the queue. Gabe Chodorow.
Thanks, and nice paper and great discussion, Eric. I wanted to pick up on Eric's discussion of what firms did with the money. Ian mentioned some ongoing research I have using loan level bank lending data. And one of the striking things we find is large repayments on credit lines by mid-sized firms in the second quarter of 2020. And so I want to suppose that this was tied to PPP receipt, meaning that it's the firms that were getting PPP are the same ones that are paying down credit lines. I just wondered if that were true, how that would affect how you think about the success of the program so far. Is that something that meaningfully matters?
Jason Furman.
So thanks for the paper. In judging PPP, I'd like to know, and I realize why you didn't answer this question empirically, what the employment impact of it is in the month of December. We could have given people unemployment insurance and saved the firms the money from employing them. If we think employment in December is determined by comparing the marginal cost of hiring someone to their marginal revenue product, then the fact that we did PPP earlier in the year will have no impact at all on employment in December. All the employment effects you found are things that we could have more efficiently and cheaply and effectively have just done with unemployment insurance. You need some, it prevented the firm from going bankrupt. As a result, they employed more people in December than they otherwise would have effect. And what do we know about that? And why should we think that a lump sum transfer, in June affects the number of people you would choose to hire after that program ends? I would think that hiring would be determined by whether or not you have a lot of customers then, not whether you got a bunch of money earlier in the year.
Austin Goolsbee.
Yeah, I also like the paper a lot. I would caution you a little on potential confounds that are correlated with size. So since the PPP, the eligibility just goes off of size, if you look at this paper that Chad Severson and I wrote, where we got the phone records data of consumer visits to these millions of different businesses, there's a very strong trend correlated with the rise of the disease of people in the same industry shifting where they go shop away from larger, busier stores to smaller, less busy stores. So that will show up in a eligibility separation like what you do in this paper. It will look like the PPP is working because the smaller firms, in fact, are having, unobserved to you, increases in their relative demand. And you're going to attribute that to PPP. So I think you just want to be a little careful about that. We can share with you the phone record data that we have. You might be able to match it by name to some of your firms.
Steve Davis.
Thank you. My first remark kind of follows up on Jason's point. I understand that a cost per job month evaluation of the PPP is highly incomplete, but it would be quite useful for us to get a handle on whether there was a cheaper way to support workers to date. And my impression is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is PPP expenditures per benefit that goes to workers is an order of magnitude larger than what the cost would have been to support workers to the UI system. That raises the issue of is there some way that the PPP is better than the UI system at retaining employer-worker matches? And if there is, what is that? And then a related point is, it's not so obvious to me that there's high value to retaining employer-worker matches in the kinds of employers who work for PPP targeted firms. It's worth remembering a couple of things about the displaced worker literature. The large numbers that come out of that literature are from empirical designs that focus on mass layoff events from high tenure workers at larger firms, okay? And often these are high share of these jobs that are at issue in these samples are industrial jobs. There's a very different kind of jobs that are being lost in this setup. And my impression is at least they involve a lot less match-specific capital and match-specific rents than the kinds of jobs that are being isolated, the lost jobs that are being isolated in the displaced worker literature. a related thing, your paper made me appreciate how little I think I know about what the value of business continuity really is, especially in the population that's targeted by the PPP. So if there is great evidence that there's high value to business continuity that extends beyond that which accrues to the business owner, him or herself, that'd be great to put into this discussion. Another thing your paper made me realize that I wonder about is how big are any potential crowd out effects from supporting old existing incumbent firms and squeezing out new firms. And the Census Bureau has these new data on business applications from administrative record sources at a high frequency. I think they have plans, I don't know whether it's happened yet, to release those data at the local area and industry disaggregated levels. If that's available, it would be extremely useful to know whether in the same kind of diff and diff designs you currently use, that areas and industries that got more PPP support experience weaker business formation, to get some sense on whether this crowd out effects are potentially important. And then the last thing is really a general comment about your paper and many other papers. I've heard frequently in recent months appeals to the need to avoid overwhelming the UI system, or to deal with the administrative weaknesses of the UI system in order to motivate very expensive fiscal programs, the PPP being one, partially motivated by that, the other being the $600 federal supplemental benefit system. It kind of really makes me want to know, well, how much would it cost to fix the administrative weaknesses in the UI system? And I realize that's a separate paper, not your paper, but this is for the editors, I guess. It strikes me it would probably cost a lot less than the $1 trillion plus we've been spending on these other programs that are designed to circumvent the weaknesses in the UI system, and maybe a few tens of $billions could fix those weaknesses. I'll stop there, thanks.
I'm not sure the editors know the answer to that question, but it is an intriguing question. Catherine Abraham?
I just want to pick up on the last thing that Steve raised, which is this issue about the administrative capacity of the unemployment insurance system. Glenn sort of hinted at related issues in his presentation. It's just crazy that we don't have, that we're running unemployment insurance systems on COBOL software, and that we can't modify the system to pay people a higher replacement rate instead of a flat benefit amount. But anyway, that wasn't what I originally raised my hand to say. I wanted to pick up on something Jason said, and then Steve echoed it, which is that it might have been cheaper to let people get laid off and then get on insurance than to keep them attached to their jobs through the PPP. I think the one thing that's different about doing those two things, in addition to whatever the value of preserving the business of the business continuity is, and whatever the effect on increasing the likelihood that come December people are employed, is what they're doing in the meantime. And we know that being unemployed is very hard on people. It has all kinds of negative physical effects and mental effects. So it's not just a matter of maintaining their income. It's what kind of state are they going to be in? And if people feel that they have better about having a job, even if it eventually comes to an end, I think that should weigh in to how we think about policy as well.
Thanks. Could the authors respond? You're not going to be able to hit all of that, but do your best.
Yeah, we can't get. I'll do it quick and then turn it over to Mike. Thanks to Eric, and thanks to everybody for great questions. I really like Steve Davis's mood music in the background. It was very comforting as he was talking. So a lot of the questions came together on the issue of unemployment alternatives, and this really does get at questions that we don't know the answer to about worker firm matches and business continuity values. So the question of whether you should have just put people on UI, even assuming the UI system worked well, is one that requires that input, and we wish we had better there. To Caroline's point, we too were really attracted to trying to find something in what's called column 5 in the tables. And we suspect the reason we don't is just that these effects really are about much smaller firms. One question that came up in the chat from Olivier about targeting, be careful. We would all like to know exactly who we could have helped, because that would be the most efficient thing to do. We don't. And in a world where we don't know these match values or business continuity values, it's not obvious really what the alternatives were. But Mike, let me turn it over to you, because I know we won't get to everybody.
Yes, and let me echo Glenn's thanks. These were all really excellent comments, and thanks especially to Eric. We tried to think hard about how to evaluate this program empirically. And if you read the paper, Glenn didn't have time to go into all of it, of course, but we tried different treatment and control groups, and we tried treatment on the treated effects, and we tried intent to treat effects. We do compare firms with 1 to 250 employees to each other, where the treatment is, did you apply for the loan? That gets at some of these concerns about comparing 1 to 500 to 501 to 1000. The flip side, of course, is that we only know if you've applied for a loan of above $150,000. And so the control group is kind of muddled. At the same time, comparing eligibility brings its own issues, because the way that PPP affected a firm with 450 employees is probably really, really different from the way it affected a firm with 15. And these are just empirical challenges, and so we try to do our best with that. To I think to Jason's question, and to a few others, part of the goal here, I think, was to preserve the productive capacity of the economy over the medium term until this situation with the virus is in the rearview mirror. The program was billed as an employment program, and so I think it's natural to try and make comparisons to unemployment insurance. But I think of it much more as a continuity program for these businesses, and it very well may be that if you're a restaurant and you survived the downturn, that the PPP loan that you got a few months ago doesn't affect how many workers you're going to hire 9 months from now. I'd be perfectly willing to believe that. I wouldn't conclude from that, however, that PPP failed in some sense, because that business is still around, and maybe that business wouldn't be all if it weren't for the revenue replacement that it received from the grant. When trying to compare the cost of this program to the cost of unemployment insurance, I think that is really crucial. Is the duration of the period of economic weakness shorter because labor demand is supported during the transition over the medium term, because PPP averted millions of business closures that otherwise would have happened? That's an extremely difficult thing to quantify, of course, but any attempt to compare how much this cost to how much UI for all these workers would have cost, I think really has to take into account those sorts of holistic concerns. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. There is an enormous amount. We could continue this discussion for a really long time. It's really important, but we are now going to switch over to our final paper. The final paper is Sizing Up Corporate Restructuring in the COVID Crisis by Robin Greenwood, Ben Iverson, and David Thesma. And I believe Robin is presenting.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, looks good. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jan, for including us on this program. It's a privilege to be part of so many fantastic papers that we have been hearing all day, including the last one, to which our work is quite related. So let me just jump right into it. Look, it's been an enormous macro shock. We've been talking about that shock all day. It's on par, at least in the short run, with the global financial crisis. This picture is showing you cumulative real GDP growth from just basically rescaling the baseline here and looking at COVID versus the GFC. But one of the things that's surprising is that the pace of bankruptcy filings, particularly among small firms, has been low. Among large firms, it's been elevated, but not substantially elevated. And if you look at the ones, I'll show you a snapshot, it's been predominantly firms that were struggling pre-COVID. So think energy, retail, and so on. So what we do in this paper is essentially ask the question from the perspective of US businesses, what happens next? So we're going to do that in 3 parts. The first part is a series of exercises to quantify how large the COVID shock has hit US businesses. And frankly, this is going to be complementary to some of the things that we've seen today and some of the exercises that we've seen to try to measure the impact on firms. We're going to look at the industrial composition of the shock and comparisons with 2009. I'm going to show you short run versus long run forecasts. So I guess we all know what happened in the short run, but there's some questions about how this is going to play out across the economy, comparisons of small versus large firms. And then the most innovative part of this part of the presentation will be trying to forecast defaults and bankruptcy filings, just trying to understand where those might be headed. Second part of the paper, we're going to talk about the triage process of financial distress. And here it's worth bearing in mind that in a typical year, 400,000 to 30,000 of them roughly file for bankruptcy. And so what we're going to try to do is try to understand what happens to the business when businesses fail, and specifically when they hit bankruptcy, which ones of them are liquidated, which of them are reorganized. And then we're going to try to zero in on 4 types of frictions that are pretty strong today in the wake of the COVID shock. So namely, the question of whether this is permanent or temporary. So what's the long run viability of some of these businesses? That's something that's been going on in the discussion all day today. How congested are the courts going to be? How big are the frictions for small firms in particular? And then how much outsiding might be needed to support this process? So whether that be through banks or through debtor in possession financing. Last, we're going to talk about some policies that have been proposed. So they're basically firms alive. I'm not going to spend time on that because that's been the focus of a lot of today already. And we're going to talk about 2, which is basically avoiding the court system for failing firms. There's been a whole series of proposals along those lines, and then various proposals to improve the bankruptcy process itself. Okay, so let me just jump right in, assessing the damage. So this is a list of the big firm bankruptcies that have happened over the past few months. You can see if you just scan, you'll see things like Hertz, JCPenney, Chesapeake Energy, and then in that other notable list, you'll see a lot of retail outlets. The bottom line here is that a lot of the firms that have failed, they had pretty poor stock price performance going into 2019. So they were already sort of dogs. Now, if you look at the impact on public firms, of which I just showed you a set that really fared poorly, this is a sense of how big the shock is. It's looking at the percent of firms that have negative EPS. And one of the things that you can see in this picture is that there's a spike, but the spike doesn't actually look, surprisingly to us, it doesn't look worse than 2008. And it also doesn't look worse. It's about equal to what was happening in late 2000, early 2001. The most impacted public businesses, I'm not going to show you pictures, but they're in the paper: restaurants, hotels, entertainment, energy, and transportation. So then we turn to forecasts by industry. So we know what happened in the short run. There's a question of what's going to happen if you look out to 2021, 2022, and you can compare that with what people were thinking at the similar moment in 2009. And here you can see in 2009, the longer term forecasts were pretty dire. So people really were expecting the mean there is minus 39% growth in earnings. For example, for the next year, and minus 27% over a two-year horizon. That looks a little milder when you're looking at what analysts are expecting today. You might ask, do analysts have any record at all of being able to forecast this stuff? We've looked at that. So at the industry level, they're pretty good historically at getting approximately right. Okay. You can also look at the industrial composition across firms. In the paper, we look at both large firms and small firms. This is using census data that was already referred to in a prior paper today. This is the Pulse survey. The most impacted small businesses, you can tell I think it's pretty consistent with our intuition: restaurants, hotels, movies, parks. The only one that surprised us here was that educational sector, small businesses, have fared remarkably poorly. Okay. So here what we're doing is trying to quantify the impact on small firm balance sheets. And we're really following a methodology that was put out by Cruzet and Gorio in a series of Fed blog posts. And essentially what they do is they ask, suppose you have a major revenue shock. So what we're doing here is 30% revenue shock to a particular firm, and you hold fixed essentially the expense structure. What's going to happen to the overall leverage? How much are they going to draw down their cash and so on? And by the way, Eric Zwick has pointed out to me that you have to be very careful with these small firms, because when you're using the IRS data, thinking about what exactly shareholder equity is, you have to be a little bit careful. So actually, we've thrown out the very smallest category of firms here in what I'm showing you. In any case, if you look at the numbers that I've circled, the bottom line is that small firms, this is looking at the leverage ratios based on a 30% revenue reduction. Small firms in the economy are going to be especially hard hit. And actually, for us, this was a surprising result, because one of the things that's driving this is actually the expense structure of small businesses. So small businesses actually tend to have larger fixed cost to revenue ratios than larger businesses. You can see that's noted in the table. Also, probably won't surprise you, but small firms tend to be in more competitive industries, and that's also a cause for their financial distress. Last part in this section of the paper is we are trying to forecast what's going to happen both to defaults, which is really happening with the larger, we're using the larger firms here, and we're using firms that have publicly rated debt. And then we're looking at the broader universe and trying to forecast overall business bankruptcies. So let me explain how we do that. For the first one, we're following the work of Angela Ma, one of our graduate students, and basically what she's doing is estimating time series regressions of defaults and downgrades as a function of GDP growth and the unemployment rate. So you can do that for any ratings class. And then what you could do is plug in analyst forecasts of the unemployment rate 1 year forward, 2 years forward, and so on, and GDP growth from the SPF. And if you do that exercise, and you have to be careful because it's relying on historical relationships, it tells you that something like 6% of firms are going to default, which is an extra 5 percentage points relative to today, and 15.5% are going to withdraw their credit rating. Basically, the same exercise here is based on some other work that Ben has done with Jilan Wang, Jiul Yang, and Ray Klunder. This is looking at the correlation between the national unemployment rate and bankruptcy filings. The left-hand picture shows you Chapter 7 filings. The right-hand picture shows you Chapter 11 filings. They basically show you the same thing, which is to say these series move in lockstep. So when the unemployment rate jumps, then you see a massive spike in bankruptcy filings. We have not seen that yet today in the data, as I already pointed out, as you can see in this picture. So roughly speaking, we're talking about a sort of a 5-fold increase in bankruptcy filings based on fitted values alone. By the way, I was listening to the talks today. If you were to even make an adjustment for what the federal programs have done, suppose you point an estimate of 22% of businesses had been saved. Well, even if you did that, you're sort of talking about a doubling or a tripling of the bankruptcy rate. Okay. All right. Yeah. So to summarize, basically the short run impact on firm balance sheets, I've just described that. We really think we're in this period right now of potentially of calm before the storm. Okay. Second part of the paper, what happens when firms fall into distress? Well, first of all, to me, this was surprising, but 400,000 establishments close every year. More than 90% of them just simply close. So the restaurant across the street simply closes, doesn't go through a bankruptcy process. Roughly 8.5% of them go through a bankruptcy procedure. most of those go through straight to liquidation. So through Chapter 7, some of them and the larger firms go through Chapter 11. Okay. Financial economists have spent a lot of time trying to think about what's the baseline value of financial distress. And what we do here before we kind of get into the frictions of COVID is try to provide a baseline estimate based on the number of bankruptcies that we forecast. So how do we do that? We'll take some of those fitted values that I showed you before and say, okay, we're going to get this many Chapter 11 bankruptcies and this many Chapter 7s. Think about how many dollars of liabilities are going to have to go through the bankruptcy system. And then apply an estimate from Andrade and Kaplan, which is that roughly 10 to 20% of enterprise value gets destroyed. It's simply as a function of being in this financial distress. So if you do that back of the envelope estimate, you get a number like roughly $200 billion, about 1% of GDP. Now, this is probably a lower bound because it ignores the impact on employees, which have been a topic today, and it also job destructions due to excess liquidation, which might have been as much as 200,000, and some of the spillovers that we've been talking about. Okay, so let me get to the triage process. So, much like if you're got a temperature today and you show up at the hospital, the bankruptcy system triages you, with most firms going into Chapter 7 liquidation, and then some going into Chapter 11. Even a big chunk of the firms that go into Chapter 11 end up being liquidated, which again may be news to some of you. So what are the particular concerns that you would have during this COVID period? I think the first one is whether the shock is temporary or structural. So if it's temporary, then you want to have business continuation. If it's structural, then you want to favor liquidation. Second is the judges may be overwhelmed by the wave of financial distress. Third, the crisis may disproportionately impact smaller firms, which are harder to continue. For example, because there's entrepreneurial know-how linked with the owner or the operator of the firm. And then fourth, a question of funding needed to support the bankruptcy process. Okay, so we look at reallocation. That's been a topic in some other work, not today, but in work around this crisis. Again, looking at these analyst forecasts. So if you look at what the analysts say, I won't take the time to explain exactly how we generate these series, but the bottom line is showing you the dispersion of near-term forecasts across industries. And you can see that as we enter this crisis, those numbers rise. Right? People are expecting reallocation away from airlines and towards IT, for example. The top line is showing you the longer-term forecast. And if anything, those numbers are coming down during this crisis, which is actually somewhat surprising and quite unlike some previous recessions. So that is to say, if we trust the analysts, there's sort of going to be less reallocation in the long run than some of us may have supposed. Okay, so all of that favors allowing the bankruptcy process to kind of take care of some of this. Having said that, you have to worry about the small firms. This is a chart that shows you the percentage of firms within different size buckets that get liquidated versus reorganized. The top bucket is the very largest firms. You can see most of those just get reorganized through Chapter 11. The bottom bucket, most of those get liquidated. Okay. One set of concerns that I already mentioned is there going to be enough funding to deal with these distressed firms? For example, you may worry about the banks. What we've done here is try to understand what's a reasonable forecast for the charge-off rates based on where the unemployment rate is today and where the economy stands today. The bottom line is, and this has been emphasized by other people working on this topic, large banks aren't doing as much SME lending as they were before, and so the charge-offs aren't going to be particularly worrisome for equity. Okay, last part of today is just to think about policy responses. Three types of policy response. The first one I'm not going to spend time on, which is really just keep the firms alive. That's been a focus of much of the other work today. So I want to talk about these two other types of policies. One policy here is just try to avoid going into bankruptcy. And there's just different ways to do that. Payment deferral, so for example, moratoria or regulatory forbearance. Bruno Meyer and Krishnamurthy have a proposal about the Fed setting up an SME loan refinancing facility. And then some work that I have with David is looking at how to facilitate tax credit to having private reorganization of debts, in particular focused on rent. Okay, so in terms of more moratoria, actually there's lots of historical examples. You can see it in some states and some cities around the country where they've been encouraged. For just to give you an example, French landlords did not receive rent from occupants by decree going, some period back. In mid-April, the G20 suspended debt payments for many developing countries. And there's currently payment deferral programs implemented in Australia, Hong Kong, Italy, and some other places. Okay. Again, the cost of these programs is they inflict a lot of pain on lenders, which are primarily banks. We're not particularly worried about those based on the other analysis we did, but so in the US, this would be something to think about. David and I have a proposal that we put out earlier in this pandemic, which was really thinking about how you might incentivize private parties to reorganize their debts. And what we had in mind here was a restaurant that owed a landlord some money, and the landlord could forgive that debt in exchange for a tax credit. And the idea there is to essentially share the cost of restructuring between taxpayers and lenders or landlords. Okay. Last set of policies is just to acknowledge we're going to have lots of bankruptcy and financial distress. What are we going to do when these firms go through the system? And tons of different types of proposals here. I'm just going to talk about two of them. The first, and we really think this is the most low-hanging fruit in this whole thing, which is, and this is my last slide, which is that there's only 349 bankruptcy judges in the US. Ben and some other work has shown that you really need to recall essentially 50 to 246 temporary judges to ensure that the workload per judge does not increase to beyond what it was in 2010. Why do you want to do this? Is because judges under pressure tend to liquidate firms, and you'll have excess liquidation, which is in general a concern, and particularly a concern for the smaller firms. Another proposal, which has actually gone into play, is this new chapter, subchapter 5, which is that businesses with less than $7.5 million of liabilities now have a new procedure. But the fact is, it basically hasn't been used yet. There's only been 576 filings when we started writing this paper. So really, this is the kind of process that we're going to have to monitor. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. The discussant is Edith Hotchkiss.
No.
Perfect.
Is that better? Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. Great, thank you. It doesn't look like the video. Well, my slides are working. I don't know about the video, so.
Slides are working, the audio is working, so you're good.
Good. Okay, terrific. First of all, I really want to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity and really the privilege of being able to participate today. So this has been great. I'm especially thankful to the authors for this paper because it's a very broad and ambitious paper, I'll say, and it both draws on a lot of the previous empirical work and puts it all together in one place for us, as well as adding a bit of new data about how things have been going so far or might be different in the COVID area. So in that sense, it's quite comprehensive and a lot to follow. There's a lot in this paper. But what I want to try and do is kind of pick out what I would highlight as the key things that I would take away. And so as Robin said, the paper kind of proceeds in 3 steps. First step is to figure out how big a shock is COVID, and in terms of what's where are we headed, or is there a surge likely to come? And also they do a nice job showing that this is a big shock both to small businesses and large corporations. Second step is what happens to these firms once they're in distress, and how might that differ from what we've been studying for many years about typically what happens to firms in distress. And the general issue, no matter when we're studying financial distress, is you've got this tension between designing a system that doesn't lead to excessive liquidation, but at the same time designing a system that doesn't lead to excessive continuation, and getting that balance right. And I think one of my main takeaways from this paper is that the tendency for smaller firms seems, or the worry is clearly more pointing towards inefficient liquidation, whereas the tendency for larger corporations may be more worry about designing policies that don't lead to excessive continuation. Overall, we already know that, again, the distress costs tend to be very large, but it's interesting to think about given how that balance is falling, maybe towards inefficient liquidation of smaller firms here, what does that imply about how big the costs are and who would bear them? And then again, Robin only gave us a small taste of it, but lots of policy proposals. What I find useful about the paper is that if you think about what the source of the inefficiency is, that can help guide us into thinking, which policy proposals would be targeted to which types of firms. So I'll comment on some of these. Okay, so step number one is sizing up the problem, where we are. Robin pointed out that we have had obviously quite a large uptick in large corporate bankruptcies, although many of them are firms in industries that were already struggling. On the smaller side, harder to get the data, but the Sense Pulses survey does indicate that obviously there's a large impact there as well. So the kind of novel part of the paper is trying to provide some way of figuring out where we're headed. And they do it in several different ways. And I'll comment on each of these, but I think that the most intriguing way is some of the forecasts that are given based on the expected unemployment. Okay, so again, in terms of sizing up the problem here, we're already, we can see pretty easily that you get these spikes, right? That filings have increased. But what's interesting about where these are happening primarily, kind of two things. One is that small firms or smaller firms are being very heavily affected, but that some of the industries where we're seeing the biggest spikes are the industries that were already struggling. And I think you can see it most clearly from the chart on the right for retail, that bankruptcy filings for small retailers had already started quite some time ago. And also for the larger, which is in the orange bars, the larger retailing companies, we're seeing a big increase now, but this is really a continuation of a trend that happened well before COVID. So this is what I mean when I say these are the industries that potentially we have more of a worry about excessive continuation, and we'll have to think about that when we look at some of the policy considerations. But again, the other issue here is that it's very obvious when you look at the evidence so far that both big and small firms, even within the same industry, have taken a big hit. The other thing that they review in the paper is expectations of defaults going forward. So not just filings that have already happened. One of the things that we have to worry about here, at least for forecasters of defaults, and there's many of them. Robin mentioned the ones they look at in the paper, but Moody's and S&P and Fitch and lots of other folks are forecasting defaults. Everybody's predicting large increases in default rates and expecting this surge is yet to come. This is all based on the universe of rated or bigger companies for the most part. So it really leaves out quite a bit of the smaller, mid to smaller firms that we would care about that don't have ratings. And I was curious, I went back and I looked at what Moody's was predicting for default rates shortly after Lehman's demise. They were predicting a corporate default rate of 16.4%. And in fact, defaults were high, but not as high as were being predicted. And again, we can think, I'll come back in just a few seconds here. Why was it then that defaults were not quite as high as people predicted and maybe also aren't going to be this time around? Like I said, though, this is missing the smaller end of the spectrum here. And that's where I think that the paper has a really interesting approach, which is using expected unemployment and using the expected relationship between business bankruptcies and unemployment. So that also shows, again, a very large response. There's a few caveats I would put in here. These things are obviously, and many of the papers today have talked about this, depends on whether the government support will be continued, renewed, depends on our expectations about the time to recovery, which is very uncertain, and so on. One thing that I would like to see, and I won't have time to get into the details, but Robin mentioned some of their estimates of the aggregate costs. They're no doubt very large. I'm not sure I would follow Andrade and Kaplan and some of the others, again, based on large failed buyouts, as giving us good proxies for estimates. But one thing that would be interesting to see is if you broke this down more by size groups, what some of your estimates for the costs overall would be. Robin also mentioned kind of step number 2. Once firms go into distress or bankruptcy, what happens? And much of this is, again, known from prior evidence that, well, 2 things. One is that a lot of firms that are on the smaller side, they don't even go into bankruptcy. They just stop operating. The other thing we know is that smaller firms, when they do go into bankruptcy, they tend to get eaten up by the fixed costs. So many smaller firms, and this is the number from their paper, many of the firms on the smaller side that go into bankruptcy just end up in a liquidation. It's really only the large Chapter 11 cases where we see significant incidents of reorganization. And I just would add one little piece based on some work we've done. A lot of the estimates here confound liquidations with sales of businesses, but many of these businesses are sales of a going concern. So in that sense, they're being redeployed under new ownership, but the assets themselves are not being redeployed in terms of their economic use. Okay. All right. So what does this mean in terms of kind of some of the interpretations in the paper? For one thing, what could affect these outcomes? There's been some significant trends within the bankruptcy system, not just recently. Prepackaged bankruptcies have been around for quite a while. We see a lot of not prepackaged bankruptcies, but pre-negotiated bankruptcies in the last several years, where firms use some kind of restructuring support agreement. And they've got everybody lined up. They've already agreed to the restructuring. They get in and out of bankruptcy and execute it very quickly. Increasing sales, again, that shortens the time in bankruptcy in a lot of these cases. And you can see the numbers on the right-hand side. The amount of time, and this kind of relates to concerns about potential court congestion, near term may be a problem, but once firms hit the bankruptcy system, they're not as likely to spend as long. And there's even been several recent cases where companies have been going in and out of the bankruptcy courts within 24 hours. And in some sense, these things are all a bit of an endogenous response to congested courts, that if it's going to lead to large destructions in value, it gives even greater incentives to either push for sales of companies, to do prepackaged or pre-negotiated reorganizations and so on. The other trends that I'll mention, and these again are going to affect these outcomes. One thing that reorganizations require is capital, both for firms in bankruptcy, debtor in possession financing, and money to come out of bankruptcy. And also out-of-court restructurings require new capital. We've been doing quite a bit of work, again, related to some of the other papers today. People have noted the tremendous levels of debt issuance, the capital that seems to be available. Interestingly, a lot of that capital is going into refinancing as opposed to new capital for these firms. But in any event, to the extent that the credit markets remain where they are or seem to be for bigger firms at the moment, that's going to ease the ability of many of these firms to restructure. We also, in prior research, us and others, we've noted that private equity firms, because they either sit on dry powder or have raised capital specifically for investing in distressed companies, they can actually stabilize in the sense of providing capital for companies to work through this period. Again, kind of the lesson here is, though, for smaller firms, they're somewhat left out of this process. And it really comes down to whether the banks will not whether they can, but whether they will be willing to extend additional financing to these companies. Okay, and I won't have time, I think, to get into some of these, the details of some of the policy responses, which is the last part of the paper. But like I suggested, I think what's particularly helpful is to think of the source of the inefficiency as the guide to, whether a certain type of firm, certain policies make sense or not. So for example, small firms, huge problem, the fixed costs of renegotiation, the inability to renegotiate or bring in new capital, debt overhang, or just search frictions, financing frictions, and so on. These can kind of guide the policy proposals both for in-court restructurings and out-of-court restructurings. So just as one example that, again, Robin mentioned, this Small Business Recovery Act, making changes to the court system, to the process for Chapter 11 that lower the fixed costs is going to enable, hopefully, many of the smaller firms to be able to survive the bankruptcy process without being eaten up by the costs. The court congestion, adding court resources, and so on, I put a maybe there because, again, it depends on this surge being realized, but also some of the offsetting effects that I mentioned earlier. But I thought, again, without getting into the specifics, it's a really helpful way to kind of organize our thinking around the so many different policy proposals that are out there. And I will leave it at that.
Okay, thanks very much, Edith. Questions from the audience? Jan?
Sure. One of the topics that comes up in the paper that we didn't address too much in the presentation this afternoon, but it came up this morning. I think Mervyn King brought this up, where one of the things that Steve Davis and John Haltwanger and others emphasize is the difference between small firms and young firms. So firms tend to start off small, but then there's the firms that start off small and actually grow quickly. And those young firms end up being much more important for those young growing firms for employment growth and economic growth. And then there's firms that are small and they stay small, and those are part of our neighborhoods. Do you think about policy interventions differently for those two groups of firms? I mean, usually we tend to emphasize the high growth firms, and because they seem more valuable, economically, but a lot of those small firms in the COVID world might actually be quite important because there's a lot of employment there, even if they're not rapidly growing firms. So we might have different policies for those two sets of firms, but we might change our policy priorities a bit for the COVID shock relative to other shocks. So how do you think about that distinction?
Thanks. Wendy Edelberg?
So I'm trying to think through whether or not I can construct one coherent narrative that ties together the papers that we've heard today about the efficacy of the PPP, what's happening with the labor market, what's happening with firms and bankruptcies. And I wonder, I think an underlying, I guess, presumption in the discussion of the paper we just heard was that the wave of small bankruptcies is coming, or bankruptcies of small firms is coming. And I wonder if, so maybe that's right. I mean, that's my intuition, but like, is it maybe that we've actually just had this massive structural shock that is creating all sorts of firms that are keeping employment elevated relative to what we thought before, so that we're going to get a whole lot of firm destruction, but a huge amount of firm creation. And the labor market has proven itself to be incredibly nimble, such that, the unemployment rate's coming down really fast and people are getting reemployed. And okay, so if anybody buys that as the narrative, and I'm not even sure that it's right, but if anybody buys that, how much of that is all pandemic related? And do we want all of these firms then that have newly been created when we're post-pandemic, or are we going to like have to undo this massive structural shock that that I think maybe one argument is that we've so nimbly responded to?
At the risk, this is not a glib response. I think the response to that question is one coherent narrative combining all of these papers is that we need to get with a program on masks and testing now so that those temporary unemployment can go back to work and these firms don't go into bankruptcy, and the PPP would have been a success, or at least a modest success. Sorry about that. Okay, Elaine Buckberg.
Thanks. I didn't hear mention of the 2019 Small Business Reorganization Act, which makes it easier and less costly for small businesses to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy so that they can reorganize rather than liquidate. And I wondered how that affects your outlook for business bankruptcies during COVID.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, back to the authors.
Go ahead, Ben. Let me just, I think Ben and David are going to take questions. Just to say thank you so much, Edie, for a really thoughtful set of ideas, and also to all of you for great questions.
Sure, yeah, I'll jump in a little bit here, but yeah, Robin and David also, I'm sure will have things to contribute. So yeah, same thing that Robin said. Thanks very much to Edie and to the organizers. This is very, very helpful, and it's been fantastic to join in. I'll respond to a couple of things. Let's see, I'll kind of go maybe in reverse order. Elaine asked about the Small Business Reorganization Act. It goes by a couple different names, so maybe this was a little bit confusing. When Robin mentioned subchapter 5, that is the Small Business Reorganization Act. And like basically so far, I think there's like maybe up to 700 firms that have used it now at this point, but it just really hasn't been used very much. And I don't know if that's because people don't know about it. I think lawyers are still trying to figure out how it even works. But I would certainly group that into the proposals that could be potentially very, very useful to keep some of these small businesses alive. Wendy asked, is the wave actually coming, and is our response too nimble or not? No one knows, right? Like it's really, really hard to predict this type of thing. And, you know, like hearkening back to the earlier paper on like, is unemployment temporary or permanent, or whatever terminology we've decided on for today. It's very hard to say, like maybe, and like Edie mentioned in her discussion, a lot depends on what the government support looks like as well. And that's also very hard to forecast. But I would say, like, my take from reading a lot of the reallocation literature is that there are like fairly large frictions to reallocating both workers and capital. And so this, my at least gut reaction is that like, it's pretty unlikely that we're too nimble, or that, and I guess I would also say, if we have been too nimble, that would mean we should be able to be nimble moving back to how things should be as well. So if you have like either there's big frictions or there aren't big frictions. And if there aren't big frictions, then we can be nimble, and then we can be nimble going back. So for me, that's not necessarily a huge concern. And then lastly, Jan was asking about small versus young firms. I think that's a super good point. And in the actual data that I've looked at, they list the size of the firm and not the age. So like from a data perspective, it's just really hard to like say very much about it. But my kind of gut reaction, at least to that, is that, you know, you asked like, should we treat them differently? My gut reaction to that is, can we differentiate them when they're both small? Can we figure out which ones are the high growth firms and which ones aren't? My guess is to a large extent we can. Like if it's a local like little pizza shop, you kind of know that's a small firm that's going to stay small. And to the extent that we can, I would hope that we could lean on markets to support those high growth firms, because that's what markets I think are good at. So yeah, I've probably talked too much. So I don't, David.
Can I add just one thing that was just fascinating to us? So remember that I showed you that picture with the percent of firms that have negative EPS? The level in general times is 40%. So it's stunning. There's, you know, if you look at, and what are those firms? Those are relatively smaller, but they're young firms that are growing very fast, biotechs. So, you know, the negative EPS, there are hundreds of negative EPS biotech firms listed. And actually, if you look at where the markets are today with, you know, buoyant capital markets, those firms are going to continue to get financing, at least in the current environment. It's the smaller, lower growing firms. And so, yeah, maybe that's less cause for concern. And that's driven by the capital markets, but you know, it's still costly to have the firm failure, even though it's a less growing segment of the economy.
Okay, thanks very much. So we're at the time to wrap it up. This has been a great, I'd like to thank in particular the Brookings staff that has helped out and made this possible. Anna Dawson and Mary King, we're really grateful to you. Brookings, we're in general so grateful for your support and for our various granting organizations, authors and discussants. You did a great job. We would really be happy if we could do this in person on March 25th and 26th. So hope to see you in DC then. Thanks very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.